This session is going to be exploring the innovation, the technology, and the future-focused thinking required to unlock higher productivity across the agricultural sector. And to delve into this and more, I'm going to be handing over the reins to our first facilitator of the day, Victoria Taylor. Now, Victoria is the chair of the Agrifood Innovation Institute at the Australian National University. She's also a non-executive director of Horticulture Innovation Australia and Water New South Wales, and is a member of the Industry Advisory Group at the ARC Industrial Transformation Research Hub for Protected Cropping at La Trobe University. Over to you, Victoria.
Thank you very much, Claire, and good morning, everyone. It's fantastic to be here, and a special hello to our delegates who are joining us online today. It sounds like you're getting a fantastic conference experience, even though you're not here in beautiful Canberra. I'd like to introduce our panel this morning. Sam Brown is the CEO of Agricultural Innovation Australia, founded by Australia's 15 rural research and development corporations. AIA targets big cross-sectoral opportunities and challenges to drive transformation across Australian ag, fisheries and forestry. Prior to joining AIA, Sam spent, I think, 9 years as CEO at LiveCorp and also had a background at DAF. Sarah Nolet is the co-founder and managing partner at Tenacious Ventures, Australia's first dedicated AgTech venture firm. Tenacious, I understand, has so far backed more than a dozen AgTech startups and to build a more sustainable and resilient food system. Sarah is also the host of the very excellent podcast AgTech So What. If you're not listening to that, you should be. I think you answer the so what question every time you go to air, Sarah. Eduardo Barbosa is the Research and Development Manager for Emerging Technologies in the Production R&D team at Hort Innovation. Before joining Hort Innovation, Eduardo spent 9 years at BASF in Brazil, where he drove AgTech adoption across South America. And Will Taing is the Director of Beanstalk AgTech, where he leads the charge, scaling transformative agribusiness models across Australia and the APAC region. Will has also worked in a range of roles within the Victorian Government, NAB and New South Wales Farmers. Can I ask you to welcome our panel? So this panel has been tasked with exploring how to unlock farm productivity through innovation. Now, the eagle-eyed among you may have noticed we do not have any full-time farmers on this panel. So we will be exploring the topic through a structural, financial and policy lens. But take confidence that everyone on this panel spends their days working with, investing in and talking to Australian farmers. So they'll certainly be able to bring a perspective to the table. Reminder, please get your questions in either online through the app or waving your disco stick to attract a microphone during the session. So team, I think Andrea's presentation was kind of sobering, right? I think, productivity's flat. There's a widening gap potentially between best practice and average practice. And yet, yesterday, for those who are here, we heard Australia's farm gate production value exceeded the $100 billion target 4 years early. We heard about record exports. We heard about farm profitability, while declining slightly, was still probably, relatively promising. We heard Andrea talking about productivity underpinning a profitable, competitive and resilient sector. And they're 3 words I heard used a lot yesterday to describe Australian agriculture. So I'm really keen to start the session by getting an understanding about what do we mean by productivity in the context of the presentation we heard from Andrea and the setup yesterday through the commodity reporting. So what potentially are some of the stories we tell ourselves about productivity? What are some of the misconceptions perhaps in the context of how ag's performing? So a general reflection on Andrea's presentation to start with, if you have a reflection on some of those stories we tell ourselves. Let's start there. I'm going to go to you, Sam, first. to provide a bit of an overview. It's a topic we've discussed at length.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I think you summed it up really well. We've got some really significant achievements happening with the $100 billion, and then yet we've sort of in this conversation now about productivity. And there's probably a few things that when Andrea was talking about that stood out to me. And, you know, it's all about effort into outcome. And I think we probably should explore that a little bit, you know, with effort into outcome in every sense, every layer from farm to the top. And I think that Andrea also alluded to gaps in measurement, which I think is something that we probably need to also have a bit of a conversation about. But look, there's, you know, I certainly have some reactions to it and have some experience here that I'd like to share. Is that I was actually at a conference that Sarah was at a couple of weeks ago, and there was some corporate agriculture on the stage, and they were talking about productivity and opportunities. And I found that they were talking about three things. They talked about the capital asset heaviness of their investments in agriculture, firstly. And then when they talked about that, I translated that into scale. You've achieved scale because you've got this heaviness that you must sort of, you know, apply scale to. I mean, mind you, they were really happy with the annual growth on that heavy asset, but the next layer they talked a bit about was management and applying management layer, and then the third was technology and how they were using technology to become more efficient and those sorts of things. Now, when I went away from that conference and thought about, you know, in my own experience, and I'm very fortunate, I come from a multi-generation farming operation. They're still farming, my direct family and my indirect family out in the Riverina. And I was thinking about those three things and applying it to going, well, how are you guys going? And actually, particularly in my extended family, they'd achieved the scale. But what they were doing is very different. They're highly profitable, but they weren't really talking about it. And when I started to think about what they were doing, they were becoming highly coordinated. So they were using multiple family skill sets to apply to a farming operation that was just creating enormous amounts of productivity and performance. So I thought that level of coordination that they were using to apply skill and achieve that scale. I step back even further and go, oh, small to medium enterprise. I saw that they're sort of suffering from that wave. They're sitting behind it. The sort of setbacks hurt them a fair bit more. And maybe they were spending more of their time thinking traditionally about producing a product and orientating that to a market. That was a little bit more traditional. So I really see this productivity issue being affected. You know, we hear a lot from the corporates. There is a layer in there that's, you know, the family farming operations that really is quite, you know, performing very well if they get that coordination and apply those skill sets. But I think that we also have that small to medium enterprise sort of sitting there that's sometimes sitting behind that curve that presents problems. So I think, look, to the reaction of that the last part of that presentation, the formula, is what I think a lot about, and particularly in my day-to-day role, and how there are so many layers sitting behind them, and I hope we can talk a little bit more about, you know, the R&D, the innovation. But there was another part on that formula that I immediately look at and go, the other. What do we need to do in the other? And that's that collaboration piece. How do we orientate some collaborative horsepower to some of the problems we face? Because I think, like I've just talked about, it's mixed farming. We have to think also about multi-sector solutions, and I think that's a part of the formula that we need to think about if we're reinvigorating this productivity issue.
Thanks, Sam. Sarah, reflections, builds.
Yeah, I liked your framing, Victoria, of the, like, what do we need to challenge, or where our mental model is sort of falling down. And one maybe implicit assumption is that the widening gap between sort of best practice and average is necessarily a bad thing. And I guess just to challenge that, there's been a lot of narrative in farming around like family farms versus corporate farms, and we don't really apply that rigor to the rest of the economy. Like, we want professional organizations, we're happy with good governance, and yet somehow in farming there's like a romanticism of the family, and I get it, like farming is absolutely personal. My dad has a farm, like I totally understand it, but the professionalization I think really creates opportunity for adoption of best practices. If we think about tailoring the research pipeline and the extension model and the go-to-market strategies for companies to recognize that you will have folks on the edge of the adoption curve and folks who aren't, and that's fine. Like, we need to just tailor how we think about lifting up the productivity for everyone. So maybe that's one to sort of debunk, that we want everyone in the same place and at the top probably isn't realistic, and recognizing the difference is maybe where some opportunities exist for actually bringing that innovation to market. The other reflection I had was on R&D slowing, and we think about a lot of how innovation and research is delivered into agriculture, and one of the tools in our toolkit is capital to fund companies that are doing that. We also work in an advisory capacity, helping get more commercial value out of that R&D spend. And so I just think a lot, are we spending R&D money on the right things? And given the cropping versus livestock and the two-speed economy and the state-based differences and the climate pressures and the adoption capabilities, that's a really complex set of priorities coming into research organizations to think about what do we fund. The folks on the leading edge need quite different support than the folks who aren't. And I'm not sure how well we're really adapting to those needs. And we're still applying a pretty blunt tool in many cases of sort of allocate funding, fund university research, hope extension happens, maybe fund it or don't, to be a bit crude. And I just don't think that's going to keep up with the pace of change in the industry. And so, we've been looking a lot at novel models for how to do that, not just venture capital and not just funding foundational research, but a whole range of things in between. And so I think there's some maybe hope to point to there in how we evolve. What do we actually fund, how we fund it, and how we think about who it gets to.
Yeah, great. Lots to dig into. Eduardo, Andrea didn't speak to horticulture or productivity in horticulture. We did get a lot of production stats from ABARES yesterday that paint, again, a great picture for Hort. There's notwithstanding individual industry profitabilities. Do you have something you could add to this conversation about productivity in horticulture so that we can get an understanding of that, as well as some general reflections on what you heard from Andrea? Sure. I know you weren't here yesterday, so what did you hear from Andrea that got you thinking?
Yeah, sure. In terms of horticulture, I do see variations as well, but not necessarily because some industries or regions are more willing to innovate than others. I think the key point is how ready industries and farms are to adopt or to absorb that innovation. And from my perspective, innovation translates into productivity much more effectively when there is a clear pain point, rather than applying a technology just for the sake of it, because that's not going to work. When there is solid baseline data, infrastructure, and capability and confidence to adopt and implement new solutions and integrate new solutions into existing farm operations and systems. And just to add to that, last year, Hort Innovation, in partnership with the Center for International Economics, released a report on the factors driving horticulture productivity. And that report revealed that high adoption of productivity-enhancing innovations could benefit the Australian horticulture sector by about $1 billion in additional value added, reaching $22 billion by 2040. So while productivity growth is quite uneven, because horticulture is a collection of many different industries, the upside potential is very significant.
Will, what did you hear? What are some of the stories we tell ourselves about productivity that we might need to unpack this morning?
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. I think the framing, from all the previous speakers already have been really poignant. I really want to just double down on one thing that Sarah said, which is in that equation that was presented earlier. The R&D plus the diffusion of technology, it's really simplistic to put it that way as well. And it is really complex to go from R&D to diffusion and the multiple values of death that sit within that, which I'm sure many of us are aware of in the capital space, in the making sure we design and validate the right technologies for producers in the way that we prove and pilot, and which is really capital intensive. The way in which we even identify a piece of technology or R&D and say, this is what the supply chain looks like, and the commercial pathways are really dependent on the makeup and the structure of industry and how we get technology to diffuse. That doing that from the very start and outset influences which R&D programs you back. And so that point that Sarah made was really important, to make sure that we actually are investing in the right R&D and we've got the right portfolio mix to kind of drive both short, medium and long-term productivity gain. The other point that I think Sam really pointed to, which is coordination coming with scale, has got to do with capability and capacity. And often when we're building technologies or we're testing technologies, we always have to go back and ask ourselves, does this technology help a farmer make more accurate, precise, and decisive decisions quicker and earlier? Because if you are doing that, then you are allowing them to make, reduce compound loss on, use of inputs or overuse of inputs or underuse of inputs, and therefore not optimizing that. And I feel like technologies need to ultimately give farmers more choice. And productivity is about having more tools and choice that expand that ability for farmers to make decisions that they directly can influence. I think that was raised earlier as well. And then the profitability games, you get thrown prices, you get thrown input prices. Yesterday, Dr. Maximo talked about all the different shocks. Now, those are all beyond the control. So when those shocks come, the only thing you have are choices. And the more choices you have, the more able producers in the industry are able to respond to those choices and drive product profitability. And so I often think about those two lenses. And resilience was also an important one. Resilience is actually a productivity strategy. We talked about aquatrophic systems yesterday in the kind of sea change. How do they actually reduce the impact on outputs when we have multiple years of heat? You can do that through building resilience in your system, and that maintains productivity or allows you to gain further productivity in years that are great. So that's a few lenses that I just contribute to what's already been shared.
Lots for the panel and the audience to dig into there, and we will be talking about some of those structural drivers and barriers, but we primarily are also being tasked with looking at some of the technologies and innovations that will drive productivity. So I'll stay with you, Will. Andrea had a bit of a two-speed story in relation to productivity. I'm interested in the work that you've been doing. Are you seeing any technologies or innovations that are driving productivity? Are they driving across industry, or are you seeing that two-speed story in the work that you do?
Yeah, I'd say sometimes, in our work, we're micro in the sense that we're really thinking out particularly farm systems. So at a macro level, I'm sure that the stats are right. We'll rely on the ABARES statistics to really tell that story. But what is really clear is that the automation that's available in cropping segments and the horticulture sector, I think you can compound that productivity gain through scale. And I think that was a key thematic there. We've seen a lot of consolidation and scale leading to step change in productivity gain. And I think that's probably not as much afforded in the livestock sector, but that's not to say it's impossible. I think that's got to do with how we bring new R&D and technology and commercialize technologies in a way that are cost effective and make it easy to adopt, integrate that in a really meaningful way so that it's easy to adopt. It almost becomes seamless. You're not really making a significant change in the way farmers are and their workflow each day. So I think it's got to do with a lot to do with design, building innovations that actually are meaningful and easy
Any
to adopt.
examples? What have you seen that you've been excited by?
Yeah, a good example, through our Drought Venture Studio, which we've had the pleasure of working with DAF on, we built we worked with an innovator that developed a collar technology, not unlike the halters of the world, but there's many different collar technologies. And one of the things that they've introduced is EMS, which is electromagnetic muscular stimulation, which is not a shock, and it's introducing virtual fencing without creating pain or shock. It's using muscular kind of contraption, and that helps to surpass some of the regulatory barriers that allow this technology to be used in certain sectors and states that have differing rules. That's one thing, and that's a collar. But the main thing that our studio was able to help with, and actually Sarah's very aware of it because she's on our investment committee on the studio, is that we transformed that collar into an e-tag, and essentially the e-tag is already something that's used and mandated across the livestock sector. So how do we think about what we're trying to achieve, but integrating it into a product that is already being used? So it's solar. You don't need to go and change it again. Much more lower cost hardware costs to build out, but able to still achieve the same, virtual fencing and animal behaviour from that. So that's an example of where we're seeing it in livestock.
Thank you. Sarah, what technologies are exciting you at Tenacious, and what sort of examples of some of those productivity-led innovations are you seeing in market?
Yeah, I mean, one area we spent quite a bit of time on is autonomy, and obviously labor shortages. I mean, no surprise to anyone in this room. And what we're really seeing is something kind of evolve that we've been talking about for a while. I mean, driverless tractors and concept products have been out for a long time, but I think if you had that conversation 5 years ago, it was still like you could point to a stand at a conference of a demo product, and now like there's hundreds of swarm bots across Australia. There's overseas companies coming in this space. There's retrofit solutions. There's small electric solutions. So we're really seeing the entrance of that technology, which is fantastic. And the way we as on the investment side think about that is autonomy won't just be replacing what machines do and doing it without a human, but actually all of the jobs that humans do and all of the jobs that machines do and all of the things that you can now do when you have autonomy is the kind of market size for this, which is so important to think about how jobs will change on farm, because even if you go back to the framing of Andrea's talk, like we're price takers on one side and we're price takers on the other side. And so the opportunity for margin redistribution and gains in profitability are just so small. And so finding these spaces where you actually can really lift, do things in a new way. And autonomy, I think, is exactly one of those. So on one side, you've got things like Swarm Farm that has a fully integrated autonomous solution. They build the robot, they build the software, and then they partner with others to bring implements or apps, whether that's spraying or spreading or mowing, to market. We've also invested in a company called Ornata, which is more of a retrofit solution, making existing equipment, whether that's brand new equipment or 25 years old, and whether it's a tractor, or ultimately a combine or a grain cart or whatever it might be, autonomous, and then having an operations center model where you have operators still in the loop running that equipment, but maybe 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, and maybe not based on that farm. So kind of tapping into really different skill sets and operating models. And then you have, like, in the horticulture space, companies like Agrifood, who are 120 kilogram robot, electric, super small scale, can commercially check it on a flight kind of level. And that's really coming from the bottom up of jobs that just need to get done, but are really hard to prioritize and to find different solutions for. And so I think autonomy is such an exciting space because the technology is now ready, and we're seeing the range of solutions come to market that fit the range of different use cases we actually have on farm, which is awesome to see. And Australia is really, I think, leading in this space because of all of the dynamics we've been talking about for the past couple of days. It's a necessity here. It's a necessity from productivity, from profitability, from climate, lack of subsidies. And so globally, like, we're seeing companies come to Australia to get this technology adopted because the farmers are really hungry for it.
That's great. Eduardo, you were at Agritechnica last year, and for those of you who don't know, I understand it's the largest farm machinery trade show in the world in Germany. I was going to ask you what you saw there in the context of automation, farm machinery that hasn't made it to the Southern Hemisphere yet, but maybe, Sarah, that's not the right question if we are leading. But I am interested, Eduardo, what did you see at Agritechnica that you think is an exciting next step in that productivity story around automation or any machinery?
Yeah, Agritechnica was definitely a great experience. And one of the things that stood out to me was the number of small electric autonomous robots that can perform a wide range of tasks in the field, in some cases even operating as a swarm, complementing each other on the same job. But But going back to the second part of your question, automation definitely has a great potential. But from my perspective, the strongest productivity gains come from a combination of innovations rather than a single solution. So when technologies work together, they tend to amplify the productivity impact, for example. Automated data capture combined with AI and machine learning can possibly result in much better data-driven decisions. And just to, still on the report that I mentioned in the first question, one of the key points of that report is that it highlights 4 innovation groups with the strongest potential to lift productivity in horticulture, which I think it might be applicable to other sectors as well. And the first one is production cost analysis, which is really about understanding cost drivers so that growers can stop doing what don't add value and focus on what actually does. And the second one is automated data capture, which underpins the next area, AI and machine learning to improve data-driven decisions. And the fourth, and equally important, is mechanization and automation. So can growers achieve productivity by focusing on only one of those 4 innovation groups? Absolutely. But from my perspective, they can achieve much more if they combine them or if they add more technology and innovations to the mix.
The cropping story, I think, is obviously underpinned by mechanisation, but also genetics and new varieties. And no one, apart from Will, I think you referenced, or maybe it was Sam, livestock genetics. No one's talked about genetic improvement as perhaps the next step change. It's what other, beyond automation, or is it all automation? Is this the story that we need, or is this where we need to be doubling down? Sam, I don't know if you have a view on genetics or other technologies perhaps beyond automation.
Yeah, of course. So, a view, I can provide some thoughts on this. I mean, I think we heard yesterday, like even the forestry guys are talking about genetics. So, you know, livestock genetics, breed, you know, crop varieties, and the advancements that were talked about on some of the panels yesterday are really significant. And I think what Eduardo is just talking about there is probably a really key lead into it, saying when you can actually get the technology to work together to create multiple solutions in the one space, that's where you're lowering the pressure from you know, the end user being producers who are already time poor and tend to have a very thorough, methodical approach to their investments in technology. So it's so super important that we actually continue to build these things together. In fact, that's what we think about a lot, of saying, you know, how do we address this sort of fragmentation of data, because everyone's sort of just saying, oh, that's cool, it'll work on my in my horticulture. How does that actually work in the livestock that are grazing next door, and how does that work together to create efficiencies? So that, and I guess we have an example of that. Like we worked on a project almost 3 years ago. We were looking at emissions reporting, and we could see it coming. We're saying this is going to be a really big issue for, you know, Australian producers, particularly as if you know, mandatory reporting obligations come in. So 3 years ago we started working on it. We looked, we really spent a lot of time in defining the problem. So we went all the way up the marketplace, the supply chain, to figure out what were the issues that they were going to see, and we brought them back and applied them all the way to the producer, and spent an enormous amount of time talking to the producer, listening to how, where their data currently is, what they're most concerned about, and then we developed, you know, an environmental accounting platform which brought together a whole bunch of soft technologies. We brought all of those commodity calculators into one location and we digitised them. So, I mean, that we created consistency for an area where science continues to evolve, and we know that we need to have a way to deploy that science. So it was a really great space for us to work across the RDCs, and we brought 10 RDCs into that. And then we sort of, you know, being able to work with the Commonwealth Department about, you know, ensuring that consistency lives on, but our consortium partnership with the Zero Net Emissions Ag, CRC, to continue to flow the science out. I think that's a really key partnership, to be able to bring science to some of these technologies, and the science is changing. It's under development. So yeah, to your question, I think we have to bring more technologies into one location. The fragmentation is going to hurt us in the long run. We have to look at interoperability so technologies can talk to one another, farmers continue to do their job.
I'm going to go to questions, but did anyone else want to raise another? Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, autonomy is the first example that comes to mind because I think you guys want to hear specific examples and real stories, and I think everyone's tired of theoretical innovations that may or may not make their way to the farm at one point, and some of these pipelines in the biotech space can take a lot longer or can be a bit more theoretical. But one kind of area that breaks that gap, we've got investment in a company called Embryo, which focuses on rapid genetic improvement in the livestock space, and it's actually, been interesting for us because we did a deep dive 5 or 6 years ago on enteric methane emissions and that challenge for especially Australian extensive cattle systems. And there was a lot of focus at that time on feed additives and seaweeds and asparagopsis and all of this kind of stuff. And so we said, well, we got to get across this space, sort of went down that rabbit hole and said, there's a lot of challenges for that space. And we had really kind of written off genetics as not a fit for the kind of venture capital style toolkit, which is one of the tools in our toolkit. But we really had to eat our socks, so to speak, when we met Embryo because they are focusing on that rapid genetic improvement space because it really aligns with commercial productivity for growers. If you can get access to embryo transfer technology, if you have a device that dramatically lowers the cost of implanting embryos in commercial herds, you can really unlock what has been only accessible to the top of the pyramid for really the commercial production. And that has a clear productivity gain and a clear environmental gain in systems. And so that's the kind of sweet spot of what we look for. And it's only because of modern technology in the electromechanical realm, in the biotech realm, in the artificial intelligence realm that enables something like that to be true. And so I guess one of the paradigms, the challenge, to come back to your original theme, is that we don't work in silos in the innovation world anymore. It's not just, this is a physical innovation and this is a biotech one and this is software. Like, these are rapidly merging fields, and these companies and our research pipelines need to be fully across that. But that's a space where we absolutely see productivity gains, through genetics, but enabled by both software and hardware technologies as well.
Great, thank you. Claire, I can see there are questions online.
We do.
And yes.
We've got lots coming through, Victoria, but the one that I'm going to pose to your panel is from Stacey Waring, and she's asked, what are the biggest commercialisation bottlenecks for sustainable ag tech and practices, and what role should government play in supporting these technologies and practices to bridge the valley of death?
So that's a great question, and one that we are actually getting to in our next session. So can I put that one on hold, because that's a almost identical question. So excellent segue. Are there any disco stick? There's a disco stick down here. Can you maybe state your name and where you're from as well for the room?
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. Great session. Martin from Wine and Exec Chair for Council of RDCs. Wanted to just get the panel to talk about, it seems to be a lot of focus on efficiencies and the production side. But on the output side, just the technologies to marry, value-based. So innovation that's informed from the demand side, from consumer and market insights. I'd love to get the panel's thoughts on that one. We had a great session on social license, social capital. I know we've got MLA doing value-based marketing. We're doing a lot, obviously, in the wine space on the consumer trends. But I'd like to, how do we get the market signals informing, and what tools have we got to actually drive innovation on the demand side?
Who wants to take that one?
Look, I'll start and others might jump in, but look, I think the innovation on the demand side is a really good question, actually, and it's part of that formula that we looked at before, is saying, well, I think what Martin's asking is saying, how do you actually extend this formula right down the supply chain so we know these, what are the productivity improvements that, can be captured out of inefficiencies down that supply chain? That's certainly how I look at it. And look, we know that there is so much information that comes from, the retailers and the suppliers when we put initiatives in front of them to get their views on, is this a priority for agriculture? Would it assist you if information data came to you in this form, consolidated, and verified, is this something that would be highly efficient for you? And a lot of them are saying, yeah, absolutely. Actually, we spend a lot of time trying to create that, and we do get nervous if we have to go back through and audit all of that. So yes, could you assist us with this? So that's a good example, I feel, that we actually go down there and ask that question and drag it all the way back. That's how you stay ahead of the demand curve from consumers, and I think you keep regulation back from stepping in these cases, and we can do reporting that meets the audit grade. Maybe Sarah might have a thing.
Yeah. Any other comments on demand side?
Yeah, I would just say that it's the first thing that struck me, and the one I was just sitting up here going, how do we talk about this? Because the whole framing of Andrea's equation around productivity was like, here's the input prices, and then here's the output prices, and it's like, okay, well, our box in which we're really trying to maneuver is so small here, and the best producers that are on the leading edge are absolutely thinking outside of that box. Like, what else can we grow? What other markets can we tap into? Like, what other services can we offer? Like, it's a really different box that they're living in. But I do think there's some structural constraints in how we think about funding R&D and how we even just divide up the agriculture industry and how we measure productivity that put us in the mental model of it's all about producing more with less, which is one of many paradigms for how we can grow. I mean, to take the wine industry, and obviously Martin and the team know this far better than I do, but something like the trend around low and no alcohol, well, where is the line on what is a wine product and what is then the purview of Wine Australia, and if it doesn't have alcohol? And so just so much of agriculture is defined by system boundaries that the world is now challenging. And if we're not willing to think about how we challenge those system boundaries, then I think we run the risk of not being able to adapt as well to the demand signals. The other one I would point to is like the research that we're funding has to be attuned to this kind of dynamic, because otherwise you're just going to be asking people what they want, and they're going to say faster horses, and you're not going to see the car coming. And it's not as simple as sending market signals back, nor is it as simple as just funding research about what you could do. Like, there's the capital intensity, the mindset and identity to shift from I grow X to I grow Y is massive. And if we're not talking about the social layers of that, the capital intensity of that, the supply chains that would need to be set up, then we're absolutely not going to make these transitions. We're going to talk about potential future crops we could grow and not actually ever change what we actually do grow.
Claire, any other questions?
Yeah, we've got one from Taylor Faulkner, which says, we are talking about productivity, but a lot of current production is being wasted on farm or post-farm gate. What is the role of farmers in the ag sector in reducing waste to increase productivity?
Eduardo, that sounds like a really nice question for horticulture.
What was the question again? I couldn't hear, sorry.
About food waste, so waste and reducing waste as a driver for increasing productivity.
Yeah, that's a good point. And coincidentally, we have a new investment. Actually, we are working on a new investment in this space, because I think there are some opportunities there to explore, not only around local solution providers for this, but also externally. I saw some kinds of similar questions and solutions when I was at Agritechnica. So I think, yeah, that's a good opportunity.
I think there was one more question down this end.
For all panellists, what's one space, we've talked a lot about the technologies and the likes, and they're there. What's one thing that we could do better in the adoption and extension space to get uptake? The average farmer in Australia is over 65. Are we talking to the wrong people at events when we're getting maybe the next generation who might be doing the farming, but they're not the decision maker? The decision maker is the 66-year-old farmer. What is one thing from all panellists that we could do better in the adoption and extension space to get these technologies taken up? And Sarah sort of touched on it a bit earlier.
And in the interest of time, a one-sentence answer, if all panellists are being required. Will?
Yeah, working really closely with a lot of innovators. Actually, I don't think it's always about putting the onus on farmers. It's actually about the technologists working really closely at the very front end of building new technologies and testing it and understanding what problem are they actually solving. So I think the onus is also on a lot of the innovators to get that right, and that will be another boost to adoption.
Yeah. Eduardo?
Yeah, I think the important point is understanding the cost drivers and understanding how you can sequence your adoption of new technologies, and always answer the basic question: what is the lowest risk opportunity where the potential solution, potential innovation can deliver the highest impact for the business? So I think that's the important point.
Sarah?
I have a story I really want to tell, but I'll do one sentence or two sentences. One sentence, broaden the menu of tools in your adoption toolkit that we currently have. We think a lot about like shove everything we've already built down the neck of the producers and then get mad that they're not adopting it. So broaden the menu. And then the other one is, are we even funding the stuff that they want to adopt in the first place?
Sam?
I have two things. I think, Steve, I would go, I think that it is timing. Get your timing right. Read the momentum for those particular producers. What's the incentive? Incentive can mean two things. It can be a positive incentive, a financial incentive, or you will need this because of a consequence incentive. So a pillar that we use is read the momentum in how we do things in AIA, and that's probably one of the key things we believe in. Timing is key. No point talking to them when there's no pressure, there's no incentive.
I'm going to move on, but there'll be more time for questions. Thank you. We're going to talk about the structural drivers and barriers to productivity. It's obviously, we're here, it's a solutions day today, so we can't ignore that question. Before we do, is it possible for the panellists to answer in a 1 or 2 word answer? We saw Andrea's presentation that had productivity pretty flat, and some industries were doing better than others, but it was still pretty low. We heard yesterday that productivity probably needs to be around 2.8%. I'm interested from each of you, just to frame the next conversation, do the next round of productivity gains need to be step change, fast, or do we get value from incremental, change, 1%, we see cropping at 1% sort of year on year? What, Sam, super quick, incremental, step change?
It's all of them.
Okay, Sarah?
Yeah, both that broader menu, absolutely.
Yep, Eduardo?
Same.
Same, Will?
I think it's like a mashing up of a whole bunch of things, and you get step change through systems change. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So speaking then of that, Will, looking at some of those structural drivers, Beanstalk ran the Future Drought Fund Venture Studio on behalf of DAF. Interested in that model and interested in your reflections on why DAF invested in you to run a venture model for innovation and tech translation, and perhaps, what did you learn from that process?
Yeah, well, it can go on for a very long time, but I'll try to keep it short. Well, first of all, we ran over the last 2.5 years a program that focused really acutely on the R&D component and the conceptual research that's happening, and trying to get that into unencumbered investable solutions. And just to maybe clarify it there, like, this is not an accelerator. Accelerators are formed, the technologies are proven to a certain degree, and the acceleration is part of the startup ecosystem that's really trying to drive scale in innovation. This is more a program that's focused on complementing R&D and commercialization, so pre-startup ecosystem in many ways. And so that's an important distinction. One of the things through that process that we uncovered is that those 4 valleys of death absolutely needs to be wrapped in together and thought about it systematically. So, how do we work with the research institutions, universities, RDCs, CRCs, independent researchers, to actually identify what does their IP or piece of research do? Does it solve a specific problem? And if it does solve a problem, what's the pathway to solving that problem? And that pathway is influenced heavily by the agricultural supply chain. So we've got only a handful of distribution channels to market. So if you are trying to get this to the end farmer and you've got 2 distribution partners that you need to deal with, should you license? Should you spin out? Should you go for an acquisition? What are all the different pathways that you can possibly go down? Now, if that's not done at this outset, the likelihood of failure is really high. And that's at the very front end of the R&D piece, and goes to what Sarah was saying, like, are we investing in the right R&D? The second around that is validation. Like, validating the right solutions in ag is really complex, because you need microbiologists, you need biotechnologists, you need engineers, data engineers, and so that validation piece is the bit that often is really difficult and difficult to find in one spot that's focused on commercialization. So that validation piece is one that we work carefully on. The proving bit is one that's probably most familiar. Slow, takes long, capital intensive, very, very driven by specific farming systems. And so selecting the right pilot trials that help communicate scale is another, the third valley of death. And then the last bit is around scaling. So the scaling requires capital. And we know that in Australia, I think many could say Tenacious was one of the first funds that are investing and created that investment class here in Australia. Now we've got many other funds at RDCs and indeed other funds are tapping into and seeing this as investment class. But still, we need more depth and we need more breadth in the type of toolkit. So it's not just venture capital, it's much more patient, blended, and concessional capital to actually fund the different stages of technology development in ag. So that's what we proved out during this process, and really applaud the DAF for actually backing that, because it was really novel. It's the first in the whole region for it to happen, and we were able to now bring, there's 12 new products in market, 8 of which we've spun out from universities. And we've actually structured commercial arrangements with universities to unencumber that. And that is a long process up the front. And to get to work with universities, build the capacity to understand how to do that, and work together with the innovators and researchers to do that is where we spent most of our time in this program. Yeah.
And certainly in Andrea's presentation, she spoke to accelerating diffusion as a key driver. And I wonder, Eduardo, and Sarah's sort of touched on it, as has Will, that how does R&D need to evolve, I guess, so that innovation does move faster from trial to commercialisation?
In my experience, innovation moves faster when industry is deeply involved in R&D, rather than something research hands over at the end. So when industry is deeply involved, trials reflect real commercial conditions, which is critical for adoption and for scaling outcomes beyond pilots. So we have an example of one of our projects where Flavorite, one of the leading players in the protected cropping space and a collaborator in this project, validated a new automated pollination system last year. And that system delivered significant optimization in labor requirements. Now they're transitioning this system into their commercial production. They have published all about this if anyone is interested. But the point is we have Flavorite as an active industry partner working alongside a technology provider and a researcher. And for me, that's the perfect combination to quickly translate research into tangible outcomes and widespread practice.
This all sounds great. It was stark to me in Andrea's presentation that some of the major productivity barriers are perceived with sitting within government, so regulation and compliance, and that they're a bigger barrier, or perceived as a bigger barrier in agriculture than in other parts of the economy. Catherine de Fontenay from the Productivity Commission yesterday observed that you have a lot of codes. So not only do we have compliance and regulation, but a lot of our market behaviour is codified for some industries. And so speaking to regulation as a barrier to productivity, the person on the panel you may least expect to be obsessed with this topic is our venture capitalist, Sarah. Sarah, I know that you've been thinking about regulation in particular. Interested in your insights from an investment thesis perspective. Why is regulation on your mind?
Absolutely. So the first one is to the point I made before about challenging identities. We very much don't see ourselves as a venture capital firm. Like, we see ourselves as delivering innovation to the sector through a range of tools, one of which is venture capital, another of which is our partnership with Wine Australia that looks beyond venture capital as a tool to bring benefit to industry. We also focus on getting more commercial value out of R&D, and so my own horse that I'm going to keep whipping is just around VC is $18 billion of private sector capital and $30 billion of public market value in the last 4 years alone in venture capital and ag tech was put in a pile and burned. There's plenty of evidence that this is a really challenging model for this sector, and we also need it to drive new forms of innovation. So that's my soapbox piece for this panel, which I can't help myself. But regulation is absolutely part of that system, and part of what we need to unlock adoption. The example that comes to mind for me is, again, in the autonomy space, where it's we have a code of practice, and there's been really good work a couple years ago funded by RDCs about autonomy on farm and best practices, but we're really missing that not regulatory clarity, but operational and commercial certainty. Who bears the liability? What happens if there is an incident? Who's going to insure these products? And those are really tough, tricky questions that no one has an incentive to ask. Because if you're a technology developer, proposing that your company could incur that problem is challenging. If you're a grower, proposing that could happen. If you're, no one has an incentive to say this is a real thing. And yet the worst outcome for Australian agricultural productivity is a truck swerves to avoid a robot and God forbid hits someone. And that could happen, right? And let's get ahead of that. And so one of the things we've been thinking about from a systems perspective is creating an autonomy sandbox, not regulations yet, but give industry the operating clarity that's needed to figure out how these really rapidly emerging technologies are changing practices, and then have industry say, here's how we could be regulated, here's the codes of practice, here's what we're actually worried about, and create the incentive to raise the hand and say, we actually do see a problem here, and we want to solve it, but without the safety to do that, no one's going to raise their hand, and we're going to go the way of places like California that are just going to ban automation, and that is absolutely going to be, all those companies that I talked about wanting to come to Australia to innovate here, they're going to go somewhere else, and so from a productivity perspective, I do think it's a massive unlock, and it is, to be clear, it does not come in with regulations, it is create the conditions to set up proper regulations and codes and best practices so that it's industry-led, so that we get the productivity benefits.
Right. Will, what are you seeing in the work you do in Asia and the APAC region as well? Is this an issue that you're seeing government needs to unlock?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest uptakes globally in drone innovation in the agriculture sector, you can see great examples of that in India. They created that regulatory sandbox, and I wrote sandbox here and then, but that's where, the government led that to actually work with industry to actually test some of those technologies, and now they're using autonomous spraying and a whole bunch of mechanisation in the agriculture sector, and this is in a smallholder context. If they can make that work in a much more decentralised way, there's got to be a way we can do it here where we've got much more capacity and institutional framework. And like Sarah mentioned, that actually Californian companies not coming to Australia because they're going to get elsewhere. A really great example of the opposite is we worked with, Grazemate. Grazemate, everyone would have heard. They went to the US and with Y Combinator to basically deploy their autonomous droving technology, and that's because the CASA regulations here didn't allow them to. And when we were working with them in our venture studio to build out the go-to-market, they said, we're going to shut shop, we can't do anything else. We were able to work really closely with the founder to pivot their strategy, and it was clear that the US was the pathway, and now they've gone and raised an extra $1.2 million US up in one of the best accelerators in the world. And so we not only not attract the innovation, we'll drive away innovation if we're not thinking proactively about how we inform policy and standards in this space. Yeah.
Claire, questions in the last few minutes we have. I can see a disco stick down back. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kate Denton from the Australian Farm Institute. So Australia invests a lot of money each year in research and development. If you look at it as a percentage of GDP, we invest more than the US does. We invest more in level terms than Canada, but we have consistently lagged both of those countries in productivity growth. My question is, are we misplacing our investment? Would we be better served just by free riding on the innovation that those countries do and then spend our money translating that research and development innovation to Australian conditions?
Will, I saw you jump at that one.
This is a very long conversation and a really great
Have
question.
about a minute.
But I think like the need for us to be investing in the right R&D programs, I think was already that case has already been made. Sarah can probably expand on that. But the ability for us to reach globally and bring in proven technologies that are that will benefit farmers today and into the medium term. I don't think we've even touched the tip of the iceberg. And I think that's a role for industry, governments to really play that role. If specific industries do not know what the top 20 technologies are sitting elsewhere in Canada, in the US, in wherever, where they are, what they are, and how we can engage with that here, I think that's an important lever to driving the next productivity growth. And we've been driving that. We've just launched a 5-year program for the dairy industry specifically to tackle this, but we're only doing it in a splice. And then, at the moment, they're interested in Victoria at this stage, but that has the ability to scale across Australia. And also, it's a bit parochial to say, but we need to think of ourselves as ANZ, because when innovation's coming from the Northern Hemisphere, they don't look at any state. They're looking at the whole Australia-New Zealand region as an entry point. And so how do we actually present ourselves in that way? So,
Claire, any questions online?
Yeah, we've got a question here from Nathan Penny, and it's for Sarah. Why hasn't the farm business model been disrupted, particularly in the livestock sector, in the same way other industries have?
The farm business model. Was that the question?
Yeah. Why hasn't the farm business model been disrupted, particularly in the livestock sector, in the same way other industries have?
So other non-ag industries maybe, or other ag industries? I wonder. Farm business model.
This is a conversation I want to have,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure I understand the question, unfortunately. One thing that I will say about the livestock versus cropping point and the kind of relative penetration of technologies, that a joke we make a lot is like, in consumer technologies, many of us have iPhones and smartphones. Like when they break, we drive ourselves to the store and we go to the Genius Bar. Like the cows are far less likely to come into the Genius Bar and ask for their collar to get serviced. And so like you just have an added layer of complexity in the extensiveness of the systems, in the behavior of the animals. And so I think the applying what happens in consumer tech, what happens in cropping, what happens in livestock, without appreciating the actual differences, is going to lead to a lot of disappointment about the speed of disruption. So I don't know if that answers the question. But
Sam, have you got a reflection on that question?
Oh, look,
Business models?
I probably don't. I'd probably prefer to lean in and have a conversation, a quick chat about and point out some things on collaboration.
Yeah. I've got 2 minutes left. Do you want to quickly speak to collaboration?
Yeah, I think it's a really golden opportunity to talk about it, because it was raised yesterday about collaboration and how sectors are advancing based on that collaboration. We've heard it a lot. We also hear about sustainability being a drag on productivity, or we talked about handbrakes yesterday. One of the things that I think that is a really important thing to know, when we look at collaboration, particularly in AIA, we look at creating new products where the outcome and the impact is far greater than the inputs. And that's what is really important. Sustainability is crying out for this. We have actually made some really major advancements where the world's actually looking at. OECD of doing case studies on us now. Canada is looking to Australia for inspiration. Because we've collaborated, we've brought 10 RDCs together and created the environmental accounting platform, which allows us to achieve sustainability measures in the emissions space far cheaper than anyone else has. So we talked about benefit cost ratios. When we did this project, we achieved a 17-to-1 benefit cost ratio. We talked about 8-to-1 and 6-to-1. We did 17-to-1 on that project. We created $84 million worth of value, and we prevented $54 million of duplication. that's some serious horsepower. And that's what I think that we should be thinking about. When we think of sustainability, we must be thinking about applying the horsepower of collaboration. Not only do you create the savings to meet that reporting obligation, you also create an advantage. Globally, these countries are looking at us and going, how did you do that? You've just gone to the front of the pack with your level of coordination. So I just felt I had to probably squeeze that in to say, hey, look, bigger things, bigger innovations will be achieved in this collaborative space.
It's a great point to end on. It's a great call to action for everyone in the room and online to think about how they can collaborate for productivity outcomes for our sector. Can I ask you to thank the panel?